Alrighty, you YouTube nerds. Crossovers in general have come a long way, especially in, for both capability as well as mild to moderate off roading, with their all wheel drive systems, four-wheel drive systems, whatnot. Today, I'm going to go over 4 crossovers that either I've personally driven or I've been in the presence of someone driving off road. And when I'm talking about off road, I'm not talking about necessarily this forest. I'm talking about off roading here in the desert outside of Las Vegas. So we're talking about spots that have a lot of sand, gravel, rock, ruts, and major inclines where approach and departure angles and ground clearance really matter, but as well as the all-wheel drive systems. So I'm going over 4 um, based on initial capability that I've seen when I was off-roading with my Ram with a buddy of mine who has a Ram Rebel. We actually ran across these 4 vehicles, these exact 4 vehicles and models. So I am going to list them in order from the most capable to the least capable off-road trims. Okay, so first we're actually going to be starting the Cherokee, Jeep Cherokee Trailhawk in particular. This model right here with the tow hooks, the red tow hooks. Now, Jeep Cherokees and Grand Cherokees, they are actually four-wheel drive. They are full-time four-wheel drive. Also have a 2-speed transfer case that can go into 4-low. Also has some extra features that are nice and handy, such as hill descent control. I know the Cherokee Trailhawk in particular has the off-road cruise control. I forget what they call it, terrain cruise or whatever it is. So not only that, but Cherokee, being that it has more than 8.5 inches of ground clearance, I usually say 8.5 is the absolute minimum standard ground clearance that you need for off-roading, especially in the desert, especially out here, whether you're in Arizona, Eastern California, outside of Las Vegas, Nevada, even parts of Utah, not including Moab. Okay, so what makes the Cherokee specifically the most capable out of the 4 that I'm listing here? For starters, what I've already mentioned: tow hooks, transfer case, 2-speed transfer case, full underbody protection, and great approach and departure angles. Plus, the price point kind of makes it a win. The only problem I personally have with the Cherokee is just the lack of cargo space. But we're not even talking about a full review here. We're talking about capability in general. So Cherokee, and of course, I'd be crazy not to mention, remember, we're talking about crossovers or unibody vehicles, Grand Cherokee. Why don't I mention the other ones? Why don't I mention the Compass or the Renegade Trailhawk? Simple. The Compass and Renegade are actually not four-wheel drive. It does have a low range, but it's more of a low first gear, not four-wheel drive. It is all-wheel drive with a fake low range. So because of that, that already puts it in a lower capability section or segment compared to the Cherokee and Grand Cherokee. All right, now as far as the Grand Cherokee goes, you have the regular Grand Cherokee L. Of course, the problem with the Grand Cherokee L is a longer wheelbase, which makes it a little less capable depending on the terrain that you're traveling on. Prime example, the desert. Grand Cherokee, fantastic vehicle. I owned a Grand Cherokee Sterling Edition a couple of years back. It was a great vehicle, but for that particular trim, the seats were they were actually hard as a rock. But capability-wise, they were great. It was actually very nice to have. Now, that is the top of the list. Cherokee, Grand Cherokee. Those 2 are absolutely unmatched in capability. 100% unmatched. There is not one manufacturer out there right now where you can get a legitimate off-road trim in a unibody SUV or unibody crossover like you can with Jeep. There's very little competition against that. All right, so we're moving on to number 2. All right, so the second most capable. We're going to specifically looking at the Forester Wilderness Trim. When I was out off-roading 2 weeks ago, yeah, it was 2 weeks ago, about 2.5 weeks ago. This was another vehicle that was out there. It was brand new. The guy just bought it, and he was going over, through some ruts that even gave me pause before taking my Ram on. So the only thing I can tell you about the Forester Wilderness, it does not have full underbody protection. It does have right here, you have a bash plate, which isn't necessarily a skid plate, but everyone has their own words for it. But it is a legitimate bash plate, and I believe there's one more. I'm trying to remember the other skid plate. I think it's under the transmission, but I could be mistaken about that. I might be thinking of a different crossover. Okay. The Forester Wilderness has a more aggressive torque vectoring. Basically, all these have torque vectoring of some sort. They just have their own names for it. With Subaru nowadays, they still call it symmetrical all-wheel drive, but it's actually not symmetrical. All right, what's the definition of symmetrical? Symmetrical, at least in Subaru's case, back in the day, we're talking 15, 20 years ago, symmetrical all-wheel drive meant that all tires were turning with the same amount of torque. And, each tire speed could be, could be adjusted, from the computer based on how you're turning and, how you're driving. But overall, all 4 wheels were always getting the same amount of power. Now, that is no longer the case. Now, they're doing basically the same thing that everyone else is doing, and they're doing a torque vectoring. Yeah, it's still more advanced than, let's say, something like a Hyundai, a Hyundai Santa Fe or something. Sure, but it's something that I wanted to point out. It's not symmetrical anymore. It used to be, and they did away with the legitimate symmetrical all-wheel drive because without it being symmetrical, you get this type of gas mileage, especially when you accompany it with a CVT. Personally, I am not a fan of CVT transmissions, not by a long shot. All right, there we go, Wilderness Trim. So again, you're looking at, good gas mileage, very good starting price. Again, ground clearance, 9.2 inches of ground clearance is insanely good for a crossover. In this case, it's, unibody SUV. I'll just keep saying unibody. All right. So the torque vectoring, the tires are okay. They're nothing like what I have on my Ram or what most people put on their vehicles for legitimate off-roading, especially in the desert. But they are capable. All right. So lockers, no lockers on this, only torque vectoring, which is still, if you have the system that's advanced enough, torque vectoring is almost as good as a locker. Almost. It's like, it's like a hair away from being as effective. In this example, but we're not talking about all cars and their torque vectoring. I mean, primarily, specifically, the Wilderness Forester. All right. So those are the first 2, Jeep Grand Cherokee and Jeep Cherokee Trailhawks, Subaru Forester. All right. The next one I did see on the trail, a brand new vehicle. And by the way, I think these guys, they actually worked at dealerships and they were actually going off-road testing them. I don't know if they were legitimately theirs. Like, I don't know if they owned them or if they were just out cruising and, testing them out, or who knows, whatever the case might be. But I was not able to grab any video, only because I had a limited amount of time to try a couple of these. Because we were kind of on they were on a time limit. I was on a time limit. Just what didn't happen. All right, number 3. All right, so this is the 3rd best crossover. RAV4 Adventure. Now they do make a RAV4 TRD off-road for roughly $3,000 more or $3,500 more. And the guys that I was talking with, he had the Adventurer, and I even asked him, what about the TRD off-road? And, after I did some research and what he told me, it makes sense. So the TRD off-road, the only difference between that and the Adventure is the shocks and the tires. There is no difference between the all-wheel drive system or the ground clearance or the overall capability between the two. There's no difference. So if you're looking for a unibody crossover that can handle mild to moderate off-roading, the RAV4 Adventurer makes way more sense at $35,000 starting instead of $37,000, $38,000. At that point, you could just jump into a Jeep. Yeah, technically people will buy Toyotas for their, reliability and their longevity. But the missus had a 2020 RAV4 and it had a bunch of electrical problems. It used to be that Toyota had bulletproof reliability. Nowadays, it's questionable. I'm not saying they're bad. I'm just not convinced that they are built like they used to be. All right. So what makes this worth it other than the fact that it's called the Adventurer? There are a couple of skid plates underneath. There's a thin bash plate on the front that wraps to the bottom of that front end. Also the ground clearance. I believe the ground clearance was 8.7 inches or 8.9 inches, somewhere around there, which is above that minimum that I personally would require to go do any off-roading in the desert. All right. The only problem here is that from the factory, it still comes with aggressive all-season tires, which are still not bad. But if you take that step further in moderate off-roading, that's when you need to start thinking about more aggressive tires. Aside from that, people put a lot of emphasis on shocks, struts, suspension. It's not as important unless you're trying to lift the vehicle. Aside from that, you don't need fancy suspension components. So that's why I personally believe that the TRD off-road is not a good value, and I think that the Adventurer is a way better value in comparison. All right, number 4. I'm gonna call this number 4. I'm going to use the term off-roader loosely, or off-road. I'm going to use the phrase off-road capable very loosely because there are some issues that I have with this. I was actually able to drive one of these when we were out. I thought I had all set up. Where is it? Okay, so Pilot and Passport, which doesn't allow me to, okay. There we go. Pilot and Passport. Okay, so the Pilot and Passport, we're just gonna click on the Passport. More specifically, the Trail Sport Edition, all right? So the the Passport and the Pilot actually have the same exact wheelbase. The only thing that hinders the Pilot is that because it's a little longer in the back, you have less departure angles. The angle is not as swift as the Passport. So with the Passport, the picture is kind of misleading because if I didn't know anything about this vehicle and I saw this picture, I would think that there was at least 9 inches of ground clearance on this thing. Easy, right? That is not the case. It actually only has a 1/4 inch. It's either a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 inch lift over a standard Passport. So the Trail Sport comes bash plate. You know what? I think I might have. Where is it? I don't have the information up, but I know there's a limited amount of underbody protection. Underneath, it does come with mild all-terrain tires. The tires are actually pretty nice. I don't remember what they were. I remember seeing how they look fairly aggressive. Okay, Trail Sport has 8.3 inches of ground clearance. Like I said, the pictures are very misleading. 8.3 inches of ground clearance is not that good especially even with even with decent approach angles and departure angles, 8.3 inches of ground clearance just doesn't cut it. If you're coming down from a steep angle, coming down from a steep angle somewhere and then it flattens out, you're going to have a hell of a time not scraping that front end regardless of the approach and departure angle. Without that ground clearance, you're still going to scrape. So the fact that it's called the Trail Sport and the fact that the pictures are misleading in themselves, it's the all-wheel drive system in particular that really interested me. This is probably one of the most aggressive all-wheel drive systems you can get next to Jeep. The reason this is in fourth place, at least on my personal list, is the lack of ground clearance. I can't stress that enough. 8.3 inches of ground clearance is a joke. All right? Now, the caveat here is that there was a couple people talking about this. I was talking to them. They said, why don't they just get a regular Passport all-wheel drive, lift it, and it'll be better than the Trail Sport. The problem is that the all-wheel drive system on the Trail Sport is more tuned and adjusted and programmed for extreme wheel slip compared to the standard Passports and Pilots. So it's very important to understand that if you're going to get a Trail Sport and you're actually going to legitimately take it off-road, you're going to have to put at least, I'd say an inch. I'd say you need an inch lift on this thing. Maybe you can get away with like 3/4 inch lift, but it's not like that really is any different in price. When you're paying to have this thing lifted, you might as well do the full inch and just be done with it. So that's the thing that I am not liking about the Honda Passport or Pilot Trail Sports in particular. Just the fact that the ground clearance is a joke. All right. But aside from that, the all-wheel drive system is one of the best next to Jeep. One of the best. I say Jeep, but I'm talking more about the Compass and the Renegade, since those are legitimate all-wheel drive vehicles. I'd say this one pretty much tops the Compass and the Renegade in terms of all-wheel drive system capability. All right, so these were my four. These are the ones that I've had experience with. Either I've seen used in person off-road or I've driven myself. If I had to pick one of these out of the four just for off-road capability itself, it would be the Grand Cherokee Trailhawk without a question. My second pick would actually be the Honda, but I would put a lift on it, assuming I could find one for a decent price, because I wouldn't want to spend an extra $4,000 on a Trail Sport just to pay another $1,000 to have it lifted. That does not make a lot of sense to me. So keep in mind, there is one thing about the Jeep I do want to mention. That the Cherokee Trailhawk has a standard coil suspension. All right, it is standard at about 8.7 or 8.8 inches of ground clearance, whereas the Grand Cherokee has air suspension, where you can actually adjust the ride height and ground clearance. So, although I am not a huge fan of air suspension, I do want to, and that's personal preference, I do want to notate that the Grand Cherokee has it. It does make it more capable off-road. I'm not sure how I would want to trust the reliability of air suspension, but that's just me. All right, guys, thanks for watching. If you have questions, post them. I also want to know about your guys' experience as well. I want to know if maybe there's something that I don't know about as far as another model, make and model that I haven't considered. Let me know what you guys think. Again, this is specific for desert off-roading, Arizona deserts, Nevada deserts, that sort of thing. What sort of crossover have you guys used, and what were your results? Let me know. Thanks, guys. Have a good day.